Hello and welcome back to my channel, which is dedicated to philosophy, music and culture in general. I am a philosopher and violinist. German classical aesthetics and Immanuel Kant. Maybe you know, there is an important text. Exists whose author is unknown, anonymous. The document is called the first program of the system of German Idealism. And the author says that he is deeply convinced that the highest act of reason, embracing all ideas, is an aesthetic act, and that truth and good are united by kinship ties only in a subtle way. A philosopher, like poet, is something equal. And philosopher must have an aesthetic sense, the sense of beauty. And people without an aesthetic sense, and such are our pedantic philosophers, they are not a philosopher. They are not philosophers as such. The philosophy of the spirit is an aesthetic philosophy. It's impossible to be spiritually developed in any field, even in history, to reason seriously without having an aesthetic sense. And I absolutely agree with it, of course. The importance of art here receives a completely different judgment, development, and already close to the aesthetic ideal of Romanticism. Despite the fact that representatives of German idealism such as Kant or Friedrich Schiller, still belong more to the Enlightenment era. Nevertheless, in the context of German idealism and German classical aesthetics, the reliance on the rational principle of the Enlightenment paradigm it is already less felt, as it could be seen in the example of Nicolas Boileau. Or Descartes, with his reliance on common sense and a sense of form and principle of ratio, a rational principle. And the founder of German classical aesthetics was the outstanding and famous philosopher Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804. In Kant's aesthetics views, the most interesting is the second so-called critical period of his work, when he created the most significant works. As you know, the Critique of the Pure Reason, 1781, the Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, and the Critique of the Power of Judgment, 1790. And the Critique of Pure Reason focuses on epistemological problems, fundamental questions that any philosopher faces. To what extent we know the world, to what extent a person is able to penetrate into its essence and subordinate it to himself, carefully analyzing the relationship, the surrounding world and subject. Kant reveals the boundaries of knowledge, so-called the thing in itself, and comes to the conclusion that the forms of communication between the world and the person who knows it are based on the relations of necessity. Man as a cognizing subject or person as a cognizing subject obeys necessity, so-called a priori laws. And person as a creative individual, and this significant point, is left to his own will. A new step was required, which led to the creation of the main aesthetic work, critique of the power of judgment, in which the subject of analysis is art, or better to say, object of analysis is art, the nature of artistic perception and artistic creativity and genius. And for Kant, it's very interesting subject. This work was intended to bridge the gap between the two previous critiques, and the sphere of art acts in it as an area where a person driven by necessity and a person realizing freedom appear in the integrated unity of these relations. Art is the crown of philosophizing, or top of philosophizing. Here a person is a synthesis of thought and feeling. One of the central concepts of Kant's aesthetics is the concept of expediency without goal, which develops the interpretation of disinterested person, disinterested in nature of artistic perception and artistic satisfaction, by the way. In the process of artistic perception, a kind of game is cognitive forces arises, leading to the self-elevation of the human being. The concept of expediency without goal denotes a complex dialectic of artistic perception. Art doesn't lend itself only to logical analysis, and therefore it stimulates the development of human abilities throughout this, including as a cognizing subject. Art should appear to be free from any compulsion of arbitrary rules, as if it were only a product of nature. And here we can see the precursors or pre-steps of Romanticism. Everything natural, Kant notes, is beautiful when it has the appearance of being made by man, by person, by human being. And art is beautiful if it resembles nature. With these statements, the philosopher develops his understanding of the aesthetically perfect, everything that is rigidly correct, he says, has something in it that is contrary to taste, to human taste. Its consideration doesn't occupy us for a long time, and unless it has knowledge or certain practical purpose as its intention, it bores us. Beauty in nature is a beautiful thing, and beauty in art is a beautiful representation of a thing. And at the same time, a person leaves this beautiful thing inside himself or herself. As a result, Kant formulates the following antinomy. The thesis says aesthetic judgment cannot be discussed or analyzed because it is not based on concepts. The antithesis is this aesthetic judgment with all the variability can be discussed or analyzed, since it is based on concepts. Kant comes to the conclusion that art criticism is possible only if the critic, the publicist, do not just convey the content of the work of this art or of the work of art through a logical scheme, but strive to recreate the atmosphere, the aura that expresses its context, and it connects with hermeneutical art, of course. The depth of penetration into aesthetic idea, according to Kant, is determined not so much by the understanding of the result of artistic perception as by the state of a person in this process of perception. So the degree of involvement in the perception of his entire being, activity at the moment of the highest tension of forces. Aesthetic ideas strive for something that lies beyond us, beyond human being, and beyond experience, and thus try to get closer to the image of the concepts of reason. The concept in art can expand indefinitely without any limit. The Königsberg's thinker devoted a lot of time to substantiating the high role of genius of art, by the way. The way in which the artist's creativity develops is based not on the rule of reason, of course, but on the natural necessity of the inner nature of genius. Genius creates these rules in his activity, during his activity. And the very nature of genius gives art a rule. Therefore, the author of the work, which he owes to his genius, doesn't himself know how his ideas for these are implemented, and it's not in his power to arbitrarily or according to plan invent them or communicate them to others. And here we can remember the Ion dialogue of Plato. Of course, the roots of these theses, I think, are somewhere in this sphere, in this dialogue, maybe. So, consequently, it's impossible to judge genius according to the rules and criteria that have developed in art before him, in art of the past. Any new step in the history of art can take place only if we have an author who surpasses the previous ones, invents his own language, his own method, his own form, and thus establishes new criteria for artists, for art as such. The criteria of artistry, therefore, are not once and for all data. So, I think that's enough for today. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you in the next video. All good to you. Bye.